Happy Halloween. What a day. So I promised everyone this video, and I'm going to do it. Just like I said. But before I tell you the scariest stories I'm telling you now, which is the name of this episode, before I do that, I should relay what happened to me today, because it's possibly the scariest story of all. And I know you probably shouldn't start with the scariest story, but I figure I owe everyone an explanation as to what's going on with my face. Earlier today, I was door dashing. I don't usually door dash Halloween because holidays don't really yield much in the way of extra money, but it's probably too many dashers on the road. That seems to be the problem in general, but I decided I would make an exception. Today I would go out because I've not been making much money at all recently. Today I would go out in the morning early and I would sit there and try and make $100 before I call it quits and go home. Well, it became clear pretty soon that wasn't going to happen. I'd been out there about 3 hours. I'd made about $37, and I was freaking out, ready to go home, getting sick of it, which frequently happens when you sit in a parking lot for that length of time, and it's warm again. It had cooled off for a while, but now it's back in the 80s, so it's not exactly pleasant sitting in a car in a hot parking lot where there's no shade because everyone's parked in the shade already. But I'm over there, and getting ready to call it quits. Because again, 3 hours, $37, not worth it. I'm going to go home, I'm going to make this video, and I'm going to enjoy Halloween. But that ain't going to happen to me today. Just as I'm about to quit the app, I get an order, a good order. An order that's almost unheard of for the Santa Clarita Valley. $25, 3.5 miles. That's it. I think, oh, fantastic. I'll take this order. I'll go home. I'll do the video, etc. So I take the order, and it's a Panda Express order, and I'm sitting in the parking lot where Panda Express is, right next to the other cafe, and what else is in there? Chipotle. Oh yeah. No, I can't think of the name of the restaurant, but it's probably the favorite restaurant I go to. Anyway, it's a thing. Why can't I think of the name of the restaurant? Hummus Republic. Good Lord, that took forever. There's a Hummus Republic in there, and that's usually I get a lot of orders from Chipotle and Hummus Republic, and that other cafe, Eat Real Cafe, or is it? I don't know. There's a couple of cafes. The names. I see these places every day, but everything becomes a blur because you're not really attending to those places. You're just sitting parking lots waiting to go in and pick up somebody's food. You're doing somebody a favor. It's not really a job. It's just an expensive favor you're doing. And I go into Panda Express, grab the order. I head over to the house, and I see the instructions for drop off, and they say, "Come in the house, leave it on the table in the hallway, in the front hallway," which is not usual. I've never had anyone, except for like an old people with groceries. No one asks you to come in their house. No one wants you to come in their house. They don't even want to see you. They hide from you when you show up, and they wait and they peek around the curtains to see if you're gone before they step outside to grab their McDonald's. So that's like, I'm like, what's going on here? But it is, it's a good order, and I'm not going to question it. I'm not opposed to stepping into someone's house to set down a, Panda Express order. No drink, just I forget what the order was, but it's a couple of dishes, And I'm driving there, and I drive up Copper Hill, and it's pretty far up there, it's curving east, and then there's this subdivision, gated community that I had never seen before. And I thought I'd seen every gated community in that area, but this one was new to me. I put in the code, which is, 0703, pretty common code, and get inside, and as soon as I enter, I notice that most of these houses aren't even finished. It's one of those, there's a lot of areas like that in town because there's so many new subdivisions popping up everywhere. The, you know, you'll wind up driving into some, brand new subdivision where only 3 people have moved in and most of the houses are unfinished. But usually those don't have, the gates aren't working. Usually the gate's the last thing to go up. But this one was weird. The gate was up before the community was finished, before all the houses were built. And like they really wanted to keep people out. And I'm driving in, and the navigation is telling me to go all the way to the end of the road, which is a terminal road. It just dead ends right at a large hill. And there's one house at the end, and that house is clearly occupied because there's just cars everywhere. And it's like, sometimes it is the case, and I always thought, like, all those gated communities were very heavily policed by their HOAs or whatever. I've never lived anywhere near, well, I guess no, there's no gated community in Piru. So I don't live near one. But I go into them for work, for DoorDash. And I go out of them as soon as possible. They're always slightly frightening to me. The first time I ever went into one, I had an order where I dropped it off, and as I was headed back to my car, I could hear this strange chanting that was coming from an adjacent house, from their upper window. And the chanting was in English, but it was like, I wish I could remember the exact words. But they were talking about how how they were the keepers of the traditions of freedom, and they needed to guard against infiltrators and heretics. And it was very cult-like and strange. And as interested as I am in those two things, I wasn't interested in sticking around, so I left. And ever since then, every gated community has creeped me out. And this one was like the creepiest. Like I said, it had a gate code, and then only a few people living there. And this was the only place with cars, and I mean there were like 20 cars, because it was like at the end of the road, and there was across from it was the dirt, and there were just cars in the dirt, right by that, these enormous hills like you get in that area. And as I got out of the car, I was immediately just overwhelmed by this stench of death and putrefaction. And I thought, because I saw that there were garbage cans out, and they were full of garbage. I thought someone must have made some carcass in there. It's disgusting. It's always weird when you get these houses that are in, like I was, these gated communities, but they're just trashed. Sometimes it happens, and you wonder, how does this happen? And this seemed to be one of them. Like the house, it's one of the only houses with people in it, and it's completely trashed. But I gotta go inside it and drop the order off in the hallway. And like I said, I wish I never would have taken the order. The closer I get to the house, the worse the stench is. And I'm starting to freak out a little bit. Because the way this hill is, there's not a lot of sunlight. It's kind of, the whole thing just feels eerily dark. Because the house is, again, why would you build a house that's in shadow most of the day? I guess it's not like that all year round, because the sun moves and that, but it was just eerie. And, there are all those cars there, but it's eerily silent. And I open the front door, and immediately I am hit with the craziest thing I've ever seen. There were 10 or 12 bodies just piled up, and they were all DoorDashers, because I recognized them, their heads. My colleagues were there, and it was just madness. Arms, legs, torsos, heads. These bodies had been dismembered, and they were lying there on the floor, blood everywhere, and food, so much food. Like all the local, everywhere. Like they had the Habit, Cluckin' Chicken, there was Chuck Cluckin' sauce everywhere, Panda Express, so like 12 different Mexican restaurants, 8 different pizza places, all this disgusting just mixed together with viscera and torn limbs. And I'm taking this all in a second. And before I could turn around to leave, the door slammed shut. And I noticed that all these limbs have mouths. Like, it's as if the DoorDashers have been dismembered and each of those new members have become hungry and they're devouring the food. Torn limbs, just hungry, torn limbs devouring the food that was just all mixed together in this viscous mess on the floor. And I was slipping at it as I turned around, and the door just slams, and I see there the customer. The customer. He says, "Thanks for coming inside. I look forward to seeing you around." And I saw that he was a zombie. A talking, wise-ass zombie. And he's got this incredible appetite. And I know he's going to lunge for me and I'm toast. This is what's happened. This is what he's done. He's conjured up, he's ordered all this food. He's got all these DoorDashers to come in and he's killed them all and I'm next. If I don't figure out a way to get out of here, I'm not going to make it. So I grab the nearest limb, like instinctively. I just reach out. I grab the arm of Orange County Bob, good friend of mine, excellent DoorDasher. He's been in the business for like 30 years. One of the original DoorDashers. Like seriously, first gen. They don't make them like Bob now. You know, everyone nowadays is like, you know, in and out. But Bob had real stamina and he had a real drive to deliver food excellently, which is what I strive to do as a DoorDasher. But now he's dead and I'm using his limb as a weapon. And I think it was his right arm, because his right arm was incredibly strong and his left arm was incredibly weak. And this arm, let me tell you, knocked the zombie's head clear right off. Thankfully, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So I run outside and I'm furious. I'm pumped up, full of adrenaline. And I'm getting back to my car and I see another Dasher arriving. And I don't know, because it's full of hungry limbs. And just because I chopped the zombie's head off, that doesn't mean that it's not going to put it right back on and get back to work. You know, I've escaped, but I haven't necessarily destroyed the zombies. So I recognize the DoorDasher, and it's Clarice Lysol. She was, I couldn't believe it. A breath of fresh air. And as I see it, she's coming toward me like, she too looks like shit, like disheveled. And I'm thinking, oh my God, is this happening elsewhere too? Is this not the only zombie house in town? Because she was looking like hell, like she also had just escaped. And she's running towards me and she's like with her arms out, like she wants to embrace me. And I'm so pumped up. I'm like, Clarice. And just as we embrace, I see she also is undead. And at that moment, she lunges at my face and takes a big bite out of my cheek. And I push her off and I said, Clarice, no. And I wasn't going to dismember her. I wasn't going to chop her head off like I did that other zombies. I was just going to, because it's Clarice. I'm going to get out of there. I'm going to notify DoorDash. I'm going to do everything I can to rectify the situation. So I did. I got in the car. Clarice was on the ground. She was slow to get up. Called DoorDash. Let them know what happened. This place is full of zombies. I think there's somebody in charge who's, I don't know, maybe an ex-Dasher. I don't know. Maybe they had the idea of luring everyone to their doom. So I told that to the operator, and they asked me how safe I felt on a scale of 1 to 5, and 1 being the safest, 5 being in the most danger. And since, I was no longer really in danger, I said, 1. Because I'd escaped it. I had escaped the danger, and I was calling to warn the others. And they said, thank you thanks for letting us know. We'll mark that as undelivered, and you'll still get paid half for the order. So I wasn't completely. I still got $12.50 or whatever. But God, what a pain in the ass that was. They asked me if I wanted to block them from in the future, and I said no. I don't want to turn down work. I'm sure, the zombies will get cleared out. Somebody else will move in. I don't want to make that address. I need all the work I can get. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that means I'm going to turn into a zombie. And I apologize for that, but there's nothing I can do about it. I got bit. Strangely, though, I don't feel any different. In fact, I feel better than I've ever felt, really. I mean, not ever. I felt pretty good when I was like 9. But as an adult, I feel, I feel limber. I feel spry. I kind of feel a little happy, which no one really describes that in the literature. Usually it's just like, I got bit, now I'm a zombie. But I'm finding the moment of, or the extended transformation to be pretty nice. Unusually nice. So why don't I tell a few stories? I don't know. I'm not going to tell too many stories because I've already kind of talked your ear off. But, when stuff like that happens, you got to tell somebody. You can't just... I've learned this over the years. You can't just hold it in. If you hold it in, you're just inviting more zombies to bite you. Anyway. I'm from a really small town in the Midwest. Like in, rural Illinois. The middle of the state. Illinois is weird because if a lot of people, when they think of Illinois, they think of Chicago because it is by far the most notable thing about Illinois. But Illinois has got a lot of really weird shit in it, and that's one of my my primary interests is the weird shit that happens in Illinois, and some of it has happened to me, some of it has happened to friends. I don't think I'm going to really tell anyone else's story because I haven't talked to anyone about getting permission. Well, I think Steve told me I could tell a few stories, but I don't know. Maybe I'll save some for later because I might make this a yearly thing if it works. I don't know if it's going to work. If I'm going to be, I am turning into a zombie, which is going to put a damper on future projects, but maybe I'm not. Maybe it's all a big misunderstanding. Maybe I was just stressed out, overworked. I was having a bad day. I should just stop thinking about it. So the small town I'm from is called Minear, and it really is a small town. It's it's remote. It's smack dab in the middle of a cornfield, of multiple cornfields on all directions, as far as the eye can see. And anywhere you look, if you're on the edge of town and you're looking out, you're looking at some sort of crop. Soy, corn, mostly for feed. Central smack dab in the middle of the state of Illinois, about 20 miles southwest of Bloomington Normal, the closest city, where I didn't go often as a kid because my dad didn't like going into town if he didn't have to. Like, we would go in for birthdays, celebrations. Occasionally we'd eat out. Not really, but occasionally. Comic books, she'd take me into the comic book shops. But most of my time was spent as a kid, either down in southern Illinois with my family, grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles, or in Minear with my parents and my brother. And I started delivering newspapers at about 9 years old in 1990. And it was something I did until 1999. So for like 9 years, I delivered up to 3 different newspapers. The Bloomington Normal Pantograph, the Peoria Journal-Star, and the Pekin Daily Times. And I would also sub on other people's routes. And there was one week, in the middle of summer, where I was subbing for a friend. And this friend had a route that included the downtown area, what little downtown area in my near there was, which included the hardware store where you would rent movies and get your hardware, the pharmacy, the liquor store, the restaurants, what few restaurants there were. There was a pretty well-known restaurant, and then a smaller diner. And there was also a two-story building where, with a spiral, sort of really rickety spiral plastic metal staircase. Like the steps were metal and the railings were plastic, very cheap. And they led upstairs. It was this large building on the edge of Main Street. It was an apartment complex upstairs. Downstairs were businesses, upstairs apartments. And you could either take an elevator from the inside or you could access the apartments via the spiral staircases on the outside. And I had to deliver a newspaper to one of these apartments that were right up on the outside of the spiral staircase. And that particular apartment, the entire time I was substituting, the door was left open every morning. And the entire inside of the apartment was bathed in an eerie red light. It was very Lynchian. And I was a teenager. I loved, most teenagers love David Lynch, and I was no exception. So I loved that apartment. I looked forward to going to it. I thought of it as the Lynch apartment. But I never looked inside. I never peered inside because I never knew why the door was open. I just threw the paper inside, which is what I was told to do. My friend who I was subbing from never mentioned the apartment being open, and I honestly don't think I ever asked him about it. I just sort of accepted it as what's real, and enjoyed the strange feeling I got every day, that rickety trek up the spiral staircase, which I felt could collapse at any moment, although it was perfectly safe. And then this strange red glow from inside that room. But then one day I was feeling particularly adventurous. It was a really beautiful morning, still dark out. I like to start as early as possible, and the papers arrived around 4:30 a.m. And in summer, I was often already up. As a teenager, I liked to stay up as late as I could. And I think this is one of those days where I'd been up all night. And it was, by this point, it was around 4:45, maybe 5. No, because it would have been early in the route. So around 4:40, 4:45, still dark. And I go up there and I think, the night's so beautiful. It's early in the morning. I don't even think anyone lives here. I don't know. I mean, the papers are gone the next day, so someone's picking them up. But from where I stand in the hallway, with the door wide open, there's no furniture. There doesn't seem to be any furniture in the room at all. So maybe it was someone who was working on the apartment during the day and would leave. That was how I rationalized it anyway. Like it was a place where people only were during the day. And it was not yet day. And I took this as permission to enter. Teenagers often don't have the best sense of what other people call private property. And I was no exception. I didn't plan on taking anything or even snooping around, if in fact there was anything to take or snoop around in. I just planned on looking, seeing. And as I peer around the corner, I hear some rustling, and it's a familiar rustling sound. It's like the sound of a dog in a cage, like a kenneled dog for the night. It's just sort of readjusting itself. And some chains, clinking chains. But I hadn't yet turned to look at it. I was just admiring the red glow, and there was no real furniture in the room, except a tiny bed up against the far wall, right next to what I believed to be the doorway to the bathroom. And there was a white, like a normal colored light coming out from underneath the bathroom door. And I sort of paused and was about to go because I thought, okay, someone is here. They're in the bathroom. Maybe they sleep on that tiny bed at night. I don't know why they're sleeping in a room with no furniture, but this seems to be the case. But I hadn't yet scanned the entire room. I was looking at that bed and that door. And so as I turned to leave, I, completed the turn of my head to turn back toward the door. And I think I'm going to see the dog now, the rustling from the kennel, which is now whatever animal is in there has started making a noise, like a sucking, like not really a dog noise. And just as I'm processing that sound, the image is becoming clear. And there's no dog in that cage. There is a man there who appears to be totally naked and is now making that sucking sound while staring right at me. It's a very strange sight. So I'm gone. I'm gone, right? As interesting as it was, seeing a naked man, or he may not have been naked. He may have just been topless. Like, I didn't really get a good look at him, but I could see his torso, his upper torso, and his arms, which were very muscular, and his face, which was this bizarre contortion of a face, almost inhuman in its shape, like a snout, like a tube. Anyway, he may have been wearing something attached to his face, but I wasn't sticking around because I didn't want to risk it, and I knew there was someone in the bathroom. And as I leave, I can hear a voice calling from the room, telling the dog to shut up. "Shut up, you mutt!" Followed by some squealing. And then I never tried to go back in that room again. I just left the paper and went on my way. But I think they may have been doing some work during the day. I really don't know. Now, that's not a scary story. It's a weird story. It's a weird story because you don't expect it. It's a weird story because maybe you do expect it. Like, it's the anticipation of seeing something odd that made me want to venture into the room to begin with. And it's one of those rooms that did not disappoint. So many times in life, you'll see a weird space, a space where the colors seem off, or the geometry isn't quite natural, and you wander into it thinking, I'm going to be transported somewhere, and nothing happens. It's just nothing. But that room, with its red glow, was very, very satisfying. Satisfying enough to never go back. So, I don't know that, like I said, Halloween to me is a holiday for the weird and the unusual and the unknown and the unfamiliar and the sudden and the disruptive. All those great things that you can often find in art. It's the most artistic holiday, even though most people don't really celebrate it like that. For a lot of people, it's just a party holiday, which is fine. It's great as a party holiday. But there is a way to party while also celebrating the unusual. And that's what I want out of Halloween. So maybe that story wasn't the best. Maybe there's better stories. I do remember one time, and this is an odd story. When I was staying in Minneapolis for a wedding, my friend Ed was getting married. And I knew Ed from when we both worked at a testing company, and both of us were constantly arguing about scores. We were trying to give kids the benefit of the doubt. So we were, I knew Ed he was a political science major, a good guy, and we like to talk politics and stuff. And so he invited me to his wedding, and I went with someone else from Metratech, which was the testing company, a guy named Peter. I'll say his full name, Peter Economy. I'll say that because he doesn't do anything embarrassing in the story, and I doubt he's watching. But it's one of those great names. You'll meet guys with great names. Not only guys, you'll meet people with great names. And you really just want to say them. I want to tell everyone I know, hey, there's a guy named Peter Economy. Did you know that? There's multiple. There's like 3 of them, and I know one of them. I knew a guy named John Paul Disco. John Paul Disco. Those are names you got to share the entirety of. And this one, so it was me and Peter Economy in this pretty nice motel. At least it seemed nice when we got there. And, for most of the night, it was fine. And we were out late drinking or whatever, celebrating the wedding. I get back, we're both exhausted, we get into bed. And I'm woken up about 3 hours later by a wetness, this intense wetness in my fingers, on my fingers. No, actually, it was this hand. And I'm sleeping on my side, this. I've got one hand is down under the covers. And I can feel a sucking. And it was a very unpleasant kind of sucking, because it wasn't the kind of sucking that involved pleasure. It was the kind of sucking that was desperate, like they wanted to suck my fingers off, whatever was down there. And I quickly lifted the blanket, and I looked underneath, and I saw this horrible old woman's face. No teeth, 3 fingers in her mouth, with her naked gums, sucking, slurping. I've never had any kind of dream like that. And at the moment I saw the woman, it was terrifying, but also oddly satisfying, because I'd finally figured out what the sucking was. I say finally, but it had only been a few seconds. And clearly it was a night terror. I was waking up. I wasn't yet fully awake. But it was so disturbing that I screamed. And Peter wakes up and he looks at me and he's like, "What in the hell?" And I said, "Never mind, go back to bed." We get up in the morning. Peter says, "What were you screaming about last night?" And I told him about the old woman that I think was just the head of an old woman sucking on my fingers, trying to devour me, maybe to take over my body. I don't know. But I told Peter that, and he laughed, because, it's kind of funny. And in response, for no real reason other than just to be a jackass, I lifted up the mattress. And on the underneath, there was what appeared to be a body, the outline of a body, in blood, in dried, rusty, old blood, the bloody outline of some strange body. And I knew at that moment, I didn't know anything in that moment, but I knew that it was evidence of something. And Peter was like, "Ooh," but not really, because it was really just evidence of an unclean motel room. But to me, it justified my my delight at having been violated by a ghost in my dreams. Perhaps. That's not a very scary story. Maybe it is. If you think about it, about what it is to sleep in an unfamiliar bed, a place where people have probably died. Have they? What's the statistical, I don't know, because I don't know anything about math. But I do know that people do die in motel rooms regularly. They die in motel rooms, and they die in hospitals, and I've been in some pretty strange motel rooms. I'm not going to talk about Albuquerque, but I could. I'm not going to talk about Little Rock, but I could. That story was in Minneapolis, with a haunted motel room. I guess it was a hotel. Is it important to note the distinction? Sure. For many years, I lived in Carbondale, Illinois. I was going to school there, SIU, initially for film, but then that proved to be too expensive, and I switched majors and became an English major. And it was when I was a film student, the first year I was there in 2002, where I met my friend Steven, and we became very fast friends, did everything together. And we were both interested in local folklore and weird shit, strange stories like I'm telling you now, the scariest stories I'm telling you now. And he found a book in a local bookstore. And it's a well-known book from the area, from the Carbondale, Illinois area. It's called Legends and Lore of Southern Illinois. And when he was going through the book, he found the story of what they called the Murfreesboro Mud Monster. It is also known by just the Big Muddy Monster. Because really it came out of the Big Muddy. It didn't, we don't know where it lived. It may not have even stayed in Murfreesboro very long. It was just there long enough to freak out some kids in the 70s and freak out the cops, and then it was never seen again. Or was it? Well, my friend Stephen and I read about this creature who is described as being very tall, with white, matted, hairy body, and a terrible, terrible, terrible odor. And we wanted to go find it. We thought, if the Murfreesboro Mud Monster, or what, as we dubbed him, the Big Muddy Mud Monster, if the Big Muddy Mud Monster could show up to some kids in the 70s, why couldn't he come back? What's preventing him from going back into the river and getting a bath? Let's go try and conjure him. Let's go figure out a way to make him return. So he brought his girlfriend Nicole along, and the three of us went down to Murfreesboro, but we didn't actually know where in Murfreesboro the sighting occurred. I've since found the spot, and it's a very nice spot, and it would have been a better spot to do this ritual that I'm about to describe. But instead, we went down to what was definitely not the Big Muddy. It was actually a creek. It was a creek that runs into the Big Muddy. But we thought, that's pretty good. That's good enough. We don't really know where he lives. Maybe he lives in this creek. Because, you got to use your intuition if you're going to raise a mud monster. And that's what we planned on doing. We were going to improvise a spell that would somehow resurrect the Murfreesboro Mud Monster, the Big Muddy Mud Monster, and make everyone's lives happier. So we went down to the creek, and it was right by the Schnucks, I think. Is it a Schnucks? It's right by a restaurant. It may be, I think it's a Schnucks. Maybe a Jewel Osco. Do they have Jewel Oscos there? The various stores sometimes slip my mind. Maybe it's a Kroger. Anyway, we went down there, and there was a shopping cart left behind, right on the edge of the creek. And we thought, must be a clue. This is probably the Big Muddy Mud Monster's shopping cart. He probably uses this to get groceries. So we took the shopping cart and we left items in the cart that we found nearby. Just leavings. We were leaving behind gifts for the Mud Monster, and they were all things that meant something dear to us. A shoe, a rubber ball, an old pen that we'd use to compose our memoirs. All those things were left in the cart, and then we started to dance around the cart and to chant various improvised chants about making the world muddier, increasing the amount of mud, but not in a destructive way, just in a pleasurable way. And we thought that might coax the mud monster out of hiding. Unfortunately, the story has no ending. That's all we did. We did the ritual. Nicole got nervous because she was a very nervous person and was terrified of the occult. And she kept saying over and over again, guys, this is how horror movies start. But it didn't. It didn't start a horror movie that I know of, that we know of. I do know that in the years since the Murfreesboro Mud Monster, the Big Muddy, the Big Muddy Mud Monster, has become an internet sensation. And I've got a few books on the guy. And there's a movie coming out soon about the very mud monster I speak of. And I've since, in a way, I think, befriended that mud monster. His name is Frank. And he's a time-traveling, door-to-door cryptid salesman. And he's Smudge Gillespie's, my friend Smudge Gillespie, that's his step-uncle. So I actually I know Frank now. And I haven't actually asked him about our conjuring, whether or not it had an effect. But it may have, in some way, interfered with his time machine. Because I know that he did have some problems with it at one point. So I don't know if it was a good thing we did that or not. All I do know is that we can take credit for resurrecting the mud monster in the larger public consciousness. Because it was after our spell that I started seeing his name on the internet more. So I'd like to think that we were behind it, just in order to give this story an ending. Because really it has none. I don't even know if it has a beginning. Probably at birth, I think. Most stories begin at birth. But talking about Stephen, my friend Stephen, he did tell me the story that he heard. And I'm going to tell this story. This is the one story. And it's not even his story. But it is a story that he has permission to tell. And so do I. And it didn't happen here, but he heard it when he was working at Trader Joe's. And when he was at Trader Joe's, he was a cashier, and he liked to ask customers if they had any strange or unusual stories, especially around Halloween time. And there was one story that someone told him that is I think, a very good story. And this is what happened. When the man was a kid, the customer at Trader Joe's, when he was a child, he had a brother, a younger brother, 2 or 3 years younger, and they would play together as brothers do, especially brothers close in age. And he and his brother liked to play with marbles. And there was one day where they were alone, just the two of them, in their nursery, in their playroom, which is always a place of great mystery, because there's a silence that descends upon the playroom after all the adults have left, that is like a layer of psychedelia that is laid upon any landscape. And it's the psychedelic nature of childhood, I think, that is brought to the fore. Because that's what I remember. The strange silence of the playroom after all adults have left the room. And you are left to your own imaginations. And the imaginations, strangely, seem to conspire. And on this particular day, the brothers were playing marbles. And the younger brother had picked up a marble. It didn't look like any of the marbles that they had remembered having in their possession. It was a new marble, which is why he was so confused by it. And he picked it up to examine it closely. And as he brought the marble up to his eyes to peer into it, he saw kind of a milkiness that was moving, like in a movie, like when you peer into a crystal ball in a movie. And he kept staring at it, and as the milkiness sort of cleared, an image appeared. And it was the image of an old man, and it was moving. The old man was moving. He was sitting at a workbench. He was working on something very, very small. And the boy couldn't tell what it was he was working on, the man in the marble. but it was something. And the man in the marble himself looked kind of like Geppetto. He looked familiar, but he wasn't just like Geppetto. He was like every woodworker he'd ever seen in a movie or on television. And he told his brother, he said, "Look at this marble. What do you see?" And the brother looked at the marble and he saw the same thing. And he said, "That's strange. What's he doing in there? What's he building?" But they couldn't figure it out, and it was starting to frighten them. So they put it away, and they played with the other marbles. And they forgot about it, like kids do in the psychedelic area of the playroom. Once you leave, once the spell is broken, oftentimes the stories go with it. But then later on, years on, someone will remember. And that's what happened. One of the brothers remembered when they were adults. And he said, "Do you remember when we were playing marbles and we saw that marble with the man in the wood shop?" And the brother said, "Yeah, I do remember that." And he described him, and it was exactly as they remembered. And one of the brothers said, "What was that about? What did we see?" And the other brother says, "Well, we're kids. It was imagination." But how did they both imagine the same thing? Or did they? For some reason, that story reminds me of another story. Of a story that my grandmother told me once while we were sitting at the dining room table. And my grandmother used to tell ghost stories constantly. She would always, she went to Gettysburg and ran into a ghost, or she went, she was always running into ghosts. Which is actually not that much of a problem because you just go right through them. But nevertheless, it made an impression. And this isn't really a ghost story, but it does kind of feel like a ghost story. It's an uncanny story. Because it feels familiar, and yet it's clearly not. But it involves trains. And Illinois, at least the part of Illinois where I'm from, was heavily dependent on the trains on the Illinois Central Railroad. Many of those tracks were discontinued in the early 80s. When I first moved to Minear, there were tracks on the edge of town that were still there because they hadn't been torn up yet. And we would follow them all the way out into the country where there was a creek where we would play. And I remember hearing trains where there were none. I do remember falling asleep to the sound of the passing trains and then asking about them later. And the adults would say, "There's no trains. The trains are long gone. You're not hearing trains." So the sound of the train where there is none is kind of a deep, something deep within me, like an early memory of invisible trains passing through the night, where there used to be trains but are no longer trains, where the tracks have been just abandoned and left to nature to reclaim them, and for children to play. But in the 70s, they were still active. And I don't know, and I doubt it, actually I highly doubt it, that the same tracks on the outskirts of Minear are the same tracks that pass by my grandparents' old house in Hillsborough. But this house, which is the house where my mother lived as a child, with her sisters and her mother and father and my grandparents, is right near a set of railroad tracks that are in the woods. And the house itself sort of sits at the end of a dead-end street, right on the edge of a little park with a large valley that is seldom used these days, and the woods, which run back to the west of the house, and seem to go on forever, but don't. They're rather small, but if you're a kid, you think that's the rest of the world. When you gaze, I would sit at my on the front porch of my grandparents' house, and I would gaze out at the woods, again imagining the trains. And I would walk out to those train tracks, although they were much more frightening because they were surrounded by trees. And I was very young. I would be, my grandparents left that house when I was 9, so we're talking 6, 7 years old. And I would go out there with various friends. And I would think of them a lot, constantly. The train tracks, the train tracks. It seemed to be a more romantic way of traveling, if I could only figure out a way to utilize them. But it was something that I thought about but didn't really talk about. But then one day, when my grandmother was visiting us in Minear, and we were sitting at the dining room table, out of nowhere she brought up a story of something that had happened back in the late 1960s, when my mother was a teenager, and her sisters were teenagers, and they lived on that house on the edge of the woods by the train tracks. That house that I found so frightening because it seemed to be right on the precipice of some unknown, some great romantic unknown. And so I wanted to explore the area. And I did, as much as I could. But this story that my grandmother told, which I keep getting sidetracked from, because I want you to know how strange that house felt. It was like a 1.5-story house. And my mother and her sisters, I think, lived on the second floor, which is really just like kind of half a floor. And when I was a kid, the stairs to the second floor were always blocked off at the top. And in order to get to the second floor of the house, you had to remove a section of the ceiling. The stairs were right behind the television in the living room, and they were carpeted, and they went right up to the ceiling. And only very rarely was that ceiling ever removed, and was I allowed to go up onto the second floor, where I would see all the remnants of my mother's childhood, which seemed so odd and bizarre to me, because the walls were still a kind of what I thought of as a mid-60s blue, and there were doll houses that were frightening, because they seemed to be kind of replicas of the real world. And I was frightened to see them sort of locked up in the attic, or the second floor that was so rarely explored. It was like a time capsule. It was like I walked back into the 70s, like so much of the early 80s was. So much of all time, especially when you're a kid, and you're trying to learn about what happened before you were born, because you know you've been born into a world, but you don't know what kind of world it is. So all the ghosts hit you first. And this was no exception. The upstairs to that house was haunted, but so was the basement, because I would hear things in the grates, and I imagined elephants in the basement, and I imagined the basement was so enormous it encompassed most of the inside of the earth, and it was full of hidden rooms, and if I could only explore them, I would find the elephants and I could ride them. But I never could, because I was not allowed to go down in the basement, which is why it was so fascinating. So you have to understand that this house had a kind of a mystique, a mystery, an odor of mystery. And it was infinitely fun to play in and to go exploring outside. So going back to the story my grandmother told. By the time she told me this story, I was an adult. And they hadn't been in that house since 1990, I think they moved. So it had been at least 15 years. But for whatever reason, while we were sitting at the dining room table after having eaten, grandmother just started reminiscing. She said, "Do you remember that night where I had that dream about the trains?" And immediately I perked up because the word trains, she'd said the word trains and dream about the trains. And I would always dream about the trains. So it was like she was describing my dream. But then she elaborated. She described the dream. She wasn't describing the dream to anyone in particular. She seemed to be just talking into the wind. But I was listening. She remembered sleeping. She remembered darkness. Then fire. Then screams. This was her dream. And she knew in the dream that the train had derailed right outside their house. And not only that the train had derailed, but that her children were on the train. Her 4 children were on the train, and she needed to find them to make sure they were safe. A terrible, terrible, terrible anxiety dream. And she woke up from that dream in the middle of the night to the sound of the train screaming by outside in the night. And she started to panic. She got out of bed. She went to all the rooms. She checked on the kids. Where are my children? Where are my children? Are they safe? She found Patty. She found Tina. She found Elaine. But where was the 4th child? Where is the 4th child? She couldn't find the 4th child. She was scrambling. She was screaming. Where is she? Where is she? My grandfather, now woken from sleep, confused as all hell, says, Maxine, snap out of it. You don't have 4 children. You only have 3. You have 3 children, and they're all here, and they're all asleep, and there was no catastrophe. There was only the dream. She said, no. Where's the 4th child? And I think about that when I think about trains. And when I think about my own childish obsession with the sound of them and how they would echo through my own dreams, even though I didn't live anywhere near train tracks, nowhere near any train tracks that were working anyway. The only train tracks were in disuse. But that house they had at the edge of the street was on Crittenden Street in Hillsborough. So strange. My cousin won't even talk about it. She finds it so frightening. But I remember it fondly. I'd love to go back there. I remember that they had on the wall, right by the bathroom in the hallway, which was right opposite a window looking out into the woods, they had a painting of a young boy, 8 or 9, who seemed to be in the woods hunting, and he was just relaxing on a hunting trip alone. And that boy to me always looked like a ghost. And I knew that, or I had heard a story, someone had told me that an old relative of mine had committed suicide by gunshot in the woods. And so for some reason, I always associated that painting with him. And one day when I was alone in the house, or at least I think my grandparents were possibly in the kitchen, which is a room very far away, I was gazing at that painting, and then I turned from looking at the painting to looking out the window, And when I turned my head, I saw in the woods outside the window that very same boy from the painting. Only he was moving. And he looked a lot like me. So I turned and, I don't know. What do you do when you're confronted with that sort of thing? You can't tell anybody. You just sort of have to absorb it privately. Childhood is full of strange delusions, psychedelic experiences, testing the limits of consciousness. You don't need drugs, you just need ignorance. It's a kind of beauty that's also a kind of ugliness. I remember my grandmother would babysit all the neighborhood kids. And so I was always meeting kids that were my age, but my grandmother lived 2 hours south of where I lived. So we only really saw them on vacation or during holidays. And, you know, they lived down in Hillsboro, Illinois. We lived 100 miles north in Minear. And Hillsboro is much... There are fields, but it's much more wooded. It's much greener. And so I liked hanging out with the kids in that town because it seemed to be a completely different way of living. I remember seeing them take the bus and think that was like a kind of privilege, whereas in my town it was so small I could walk to school in a matter of minutes. But their town was so large they had to get into an automobile just to find it. So I was jealous of that. And I was, well, not exactly jealous, curious. I think you should say curious. I was curious of that. And I remember that there were two girls named Rachel and Rosalind. And they had a little brother named Rusty Gray. And I remember Rusty Gray was an odd kid. He was always getting in trouble. He was one of those kids that was, in the country, I mean, you get them everywhere, but there's a certain type of redneck kid who's just like a doll, like a crash test dummy. It's like they just bounce everywhere. They're always injuring themselves without getting hurt. They're always getting into catastrophic accidents that go nowhere, and they find themselves completely unharmed. And this kid fell out of a 3-story window, and he was fine. He just walked funny for a few minutes. But anyway, he had these two twin sisters, Rachel and Rosalind. And the first time I met them, I thought they were ghosts. Because their mother, this was the early 80s, and their mother made all their dresses by hand, and she had a very old-fashioned sensibility. So there were these two girls who were my age, twins, identical, dressed alike, in what seemed to me to be 19th century garb, but was just some country style of homemade dressmaking. And so the first time I ever saw them, I was playing alone in my grandparents' house, the creepy house that I had just described. And in that creepy house, you were prepared for anything. Why wouldn't two ghosts show up? So I was sitting there playing with Lincoln logs or whoever, whatever was around. And I see these two twins come up to me, all alone. I guess their parents were still talking to the adults in the other room. And I swear to God, there's just two ghosts have appeared. I couldn't see through them, but I knew sometimes you'll see a solid ghost, and this must have been a pair of them. And they say, what's your name? And I tell them my name, and they tell me their name, and I'm just waiting for them to disappear. And then their parents come in the room, and I see, oh, you've met Jeff. Jeff, this is Rachel and Rosalind. And I was relieved, because at that moment I knew they couldn't be ghosts, because they had parents, and their parents, ghosts usually don't have parents. So that made me a lot, in some ways it was a disappointment. Because if you think you've met a ghost, That's pretty good. It's not exactly scary. What I'm saying is that house primed you for anything. And in fact, I think it gave me a longing. It installed in me a longing for weirdness, because I was there just enough to not find it terrifying, but to find it blissful. And the things that happened to me in that house were just strange enough to be pleasant, without being at all traumatic or disturbing, really. Because everything got resolved. The ghosts were just a pair of twins. They looked like the kids in The Shining. And later when I saw The Shining, I was like, oh my God, there they are. But no, this was not them. They were like them. But again, less ghostly. They've since graduated from college. So ghosts don't do that. But we'd always go down on vacations. My dad liked to take us down even further into southern Illinois, into Carbondale and Little Grassy Lake, which was a fantastic lake that they've since drained. Just as I went to see it, they drained it. But back when I was a kid, it wasn't drained at all. It was a legitimate lake, and you'd go camping right on the water. And what I remember is those nights being full of strange occurrences and seeing objects in the sky. That's where I believe my interest in UFOs came from Little Grassy Lake. Because you'd see things in the sky that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Things that were too close, in fact, too close for comfort. And then at night, sometimes you would fall asleep and you would wake up, and I would wake up. And this happened multiple times. And I would hear these women singing, and I could feel them, multiple women circling around our tent, a chain, just sort of dancing and singing. And it was in a language that I did not understand. It may not have even been a language. It may have been pure sound. But it seemed to be meaningful, and it seemed like a kind of spell. But everyone else would be asleep when I would hear this. And I would never open the tent to look out to see the women, but I would know that they were there, and that they were putting the spell on us, on us sleeping campers. But then, eventually, you'd notice that the sound was not actually coming from outside the tent. The singing was, in fact, coming from the people inside the tent who were sleeping, my mother and father and brother. In their sleep, we're all making the same choral sound, which seemed to be coming from the strange dancing women of Little Grassy Lake, who were standing outside, waiting to see me. But I never left the tent, so I don't know what it was about. It's probably just a dream. I don't feel any effects still. You think, after being bit by a zombie, again, nothing. I feel younger. I feel energetic. I feel like going on a run, And that's not usual anymore. I'm usually just a slump. So maybe it wasn't a zombie after all. Maybe it was some sort of a life-giving zombie. Instead of sucking it out of me and replacing it with a foul, monstrous limb, I've just become more vital than ever. I don't know. Anyway, I'll tell one or two more very quick stories, and then maybe I'll go to the hospital, get this looked at. This story takes place in Texas, and I mentioned this in the previous episode of Spinebulk, but I lived in Texas for 2 years when I was working for Dalkey Archive Press. And when I first moved down there, I didn't have an apartment. I had a lot of trouble finding a place to live. And it took about 3 or 4 months before I got an apartment. And in the meantime, I was staying with a coworker who was the publisher's, my boss's personal assistant, Jake. And Jake had bought an apartment that I could not afford on my salary, but he let me live there because I was down in Victoria first, and he wasn't going to arrive until much later in the year, so that his apartment would stand empty. So he thought, well, you can't find a place to live. I'm not living in my new place. You may as well go stay there and wait for me to arrive. So for the first month or so, I was living in Jake's apartment alone, and it was completely unfurnished. I was sleeping on an air mattress that had a leak. But the leak was really well timed because it started out full, and by the time I was on the floor, it was time to wake up. So it was a leaky air mattress that sort of served as an alarm clock, because by the time it was too uncomfortable to lay on, because it was directly onto the floor, I would wake up, and it would be exactly the time I needed to wake up. So it wound up being pretty good. But eventually I got a bigger air mattress with no leak in it, and that was fantastic. And so I laid down and slept in that. But at first I was on the much smaller, leakier one. And it was a very, very kind of lonely, depressive time. I didn't have any friends really. I had just moved. I didn't know anyone other than my coworkers who, you know, my only real other coworker was married. And so, married couples tend to stick to themselves. At least that's been my experience. So, I was very lonely. And one thing that I enjoyed doing, sort of give myself something to do, was utilize Jake's balcony, because it was a really nice, expensive apartment with a really nice balcony. And this is Texas in the late summer, so it's pretty hot. And the air conditioning was good, but I like a good swampy atmosphere. So I would often take my computer, a bunch of pillows and blankets, and make a little nest on the floor of the balcony, and I would watch a movie. And I would, while I was watching the movie, I could look out over the way and see in the distance a large sort of a hotel. And I would always look over, not always, I liked looking over at the hotel and just sort of gazing at it when I wasn't watching a movie or something. It was just like an odd sort of, it felt like a neighbor. Like the closest thing to a neighbor was this distant hotel. So, eventually I get my own place, and, what happens, and I leave the press. I go back to Illinois, but on my way back home, I didn't have enough room to bring all my stuff, so I asked a friend that I had made there if I could use her second room, her free room, because she had a free room that was empty. She said if I needed to store anything, I could use it. And I said, I've got a few things. Can I store them in your extra room? She said, sure. So I left some things behind and then waited about a year before I went back to get them. And in the year since I had left, the entire town seemed transformed. Dalkey was no longer at those offices. I would drive by the office, and Dalkey was no longer there. The sign was gone. I went downtown to where Chak's Press had their office and their studio, and the studio was gone. The store was locked up. Everything was empty. There was nobody there. Everything that I had known in that town just a year before seemed to have been gone almost overnight. Every sign that any of the organizations that brought me to town had ever been there was gone, and I was left with a very strange feeling. I grabbed my things and I went back to my hotel where I had booked a room because I didn't want to drive back immediately. I wanted to spend the night, just take a look around the place. And when I get to the hotel, I get up to my room, and I notice that it's the very same hotel that I used to gaze at from Jake's balcony. And in fact, from the room where I was currently occupying, the room I was staying in gave me a perfect line of sight to that very balcony where I used to sit. And so in a sense, I was gazing from the future into the past, and I half expected to see myself sitting there many years previously. But for that, I'd probably have to wait to nightfall, because I only did that at night. And in the meantime, the vents in the bathroom were giving me this awful audio pareidolia, where I kept hearing big band music in the noise. But there was no big band music, so the whole place just felt haunted. It felt like I'd come back to Victoria, Texas, from Illinois, to gather my things, what I had left of a previous life, and be haunted. And so far, that's what was happening. The absences were large presences in my mind. And as I sat in the hotel room, waiting until dark, so that I could gaze out and see myself, I had this overwhelming feeling that something even stranger was about to occur. In fact, I did not see myself sitting on that balcony at night. I didn't see anything. No one came out. I didn't stand out there and just stare at it either. It wasn't as voyeuristic as it sounds. I was just sort of occasionally checking. I never showed up, which is actually pretty good, because you don't want to get stuck in a time loop. It's annoying. So I went to bed, prepared to leave the next day. And I like to, I go to sleep pretty late. And I go to bed around 2 or 3 in the morning, tossing and turning all night, because it's not a very comfortable hotel room. The pillows, it's not good. And then I wake up to the sound of my phone ringing. And it's like 7 in the morning, and I want to leave right before checkout time. I don't want to get up at 7 in the morning. Who the hell is calling me? And it's a number I don't recognize, and ordinarily I wouldn't even answer it, but for some stupid reason, I pick it up. I answer the phone. Who is this? The voice on the other line says, "Is this Jeffrey Higgins?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, we have a shipment of books. What are we going to do with these books?" And I said, "What? What are you talking about?" And he said, "We've got the I'm a driver. I've got these books. I'm here at the location, but there's no one here." And I'm like, "What books are these? What books are these? Like, what are?" And he says, "It's Dalkey. Aren't you the contact man for Dalkey Archive Press? You're the name I have to call to come pick these books up." And I said, "I haven't worked for that press in over a year. They aren't even here anymore. They're no longer at this location. I think there's been some mistake." And he said, "Well, all right. I guess we'll figure it out over here then." And he hung up. And it was the strangest thing. Never before and never since. And I'm still not sure why I was all of a sudden, for one shipment of books, listed as the contact man, and why they were sending a shipment to that location that was clearly no longer in use. If there even was a shipment of books to begin with. Was it some bizarre scam? I don't know. I didn't have to give him any kind of, he didn't need a password, he didn't need any information. He just asked where I was and then hung up when I told him I didn't work there anymore. Maybe he was searching for data. Seems like a pretty convoluted way to do it. I really don't know. But none of these stories are particularly scary. And I honestly don't know if I could think of a seriously frightening story, an unexplained story, because most of the time the unexplained is pleasant. It's good. I like that sort of thing. Probably the most frightening experience that I can recall, the most inexplicable experience outside of a dream, happened to me when I was around 11 years old. And I used to sit outside as a nightly activity. This started in 1990 when I got my very first Walkman. for Christmas in 1989. It was the first time I'd ever had access to music that wasn't sort of coming through an adult, you know? I had my own portable radio Walkman. And I didn't have any cassette tapes, but I did start listening to the radio. And so one thing that I did all through childhood and into my teenage years, I did this from like 1990 to 1998 for 8 years. Every night I'd go outside and I'd sit on the swing set and I'd listen to the radio for about an hour to 2 hours and just swing. I did this all year round. Even in the middle of winter, I would just get bundled up, even when it rained. I don't know, it was, well, not when it was really rainy, because, but even when most people would avoid the outdoors, it was like a nightly ritual that I did before bed. After I was done with homework, and, after I'd read some, because I usually read at night, usually I'd try to avoid the homework so that I could read. But if, whatever would happen, then I'd go outside and I'd sit outside on the swing for 1 to 2 hours. And I did this all through, like I said, the 90s. And eventually, in 1992, we moved houses in Minear. We used to live on the south side of town. We moved to the north side of town, one street over, from South School Street to North Maple Street. And this was a new experience for me because it was a two-story house. All through my, younger years, we lived in this small, one-story, two-bedroom farmhouse. Not a farmhouse, a ranch house. It was like a 70s style ranch house. But I loved it. But then after my brother was born, it got a little crowded. My mother finally got into a union. She started making more money. And we were able to move to a bigger house on the other side of town, so we did. And I started then swinging in the backyard on at the house at Maple Street. And one difference is, the neighbors. Because on School Street, South School Street, I knew all the neighbors, and they all knew me, and everyone knew that I did that. But when I came to North Maple Street, it was kind of bizarre seeing this kid out there in the middle of winter swinging at night on his swing set. And I imagine multiple people found it very amusing. And it's a small town, a very small town. And it isn't true, really, that everyone in a small town knows each other, especially if you're a kid. When you're a kid, there are all these adults. You have no idea who the hell they are. But they're there, and they're up to something because they have to be alive, right? They're there. And living people tend to have jobs or are in the middle of, they've got something going on anyway. And one thing I did notice is that we had a neighbor, the neighbor that we shared a backyard with, was also spending a lot of time outdoors. And usually he'd be out with his he was an archer, I guess, and he had this fake deer in the backyard, and he would target practice with his bow and arrow at the deer while I would be swinging. And we would sometimes just sort of nod at each other and acknowledge one another's presence. And that was, and I got to kind of enjoy seeing him out there. Well, one night, and it wasn't even late at night, it was still light out. It hadn't even gotten dark yet. It was in late winter, early spring. So it was fairly early in the day. I remember I had a Boy Scout thing later that evening, so I was out on the swing before the meeting because I wanted to get my swinging over with early. So it was still light out. And it was right before dinner. So it would have been late afternoon. And I was just out on my swing like I always was, listening to the radio. When all of a sudden, from behind a shed, because we had a shed in the backyard, so I would sit on the swing set, and to my left, I'd see the house, and to my right, I'd see this little shed, right? And then the neighbors who lived next door to us, I could see their backyard, and the backyard further on, and the backyard further on. And then the neighbor to my right is the one who was the archer. And he was the one we shared the backyard with, where the shed was. It was this little blue shed. And I remember this is just a deep memory for me. Because again, it was inexplicable. And I saw some weird stuff when I would sit out there, but nothing as weird as this. As I said, it was early enough in the evening that it was still light, and I was sitting and I was swinging, and all of a sudden, from behind the shed, an enormous man creature just emerges, and he's got his arms up in the air, and he's possibly a man in an ape suit, or that was my imagination making sense of the inexplicable. All I know is that I saw emerging from behind a shed the craziest thing I had ever seen in my life. And it was roaring, like roar. Good Lord, I'd never got off the swing set so fast. I screamed and I ran and I just scrambled into the house. No second thought. I didn't see where the creature wound up. I didn't see, did he keep running? Did he go back behind the shed? What in the hell was it? I don't know. All I know is I got into the house and I saw my mother setting the kitchen table and my dad sitting at the table doing a crossword puzzle like nothing had happened. And I didn't say anything. I was too perplexed. I didn't know what to say. Mom, Dad, there's a Bigfoot in the backyard. You know? That's not going to look good. And anyway, I had a scout meeting in an hour or so. I didn't want to disrupt the evening. So I just went and I sat down, and Mom's like, "Oh, you're back early. You weren't out there that long." And I said, "Well, not tonight. Tonight I'm not going to swing." And I actually don't think I swinged for I went out to the swings for about a week after that because it terrified me, and I didn't want whatever creature that was to come back. But it never did come back. And I never could figure out who it was, who was clearly someone playing a prank, right? That's what it must have been, a prank. But who would it have been? The only person I can think of is that neighbor, who was the archer, who would see me out there on the swing and would acknowledge me occasionally. And maybe he had a sense of humor that was a little peculiar. The one thing that I do know is that neighbor, less than a year later, committed suicide, and I was the last person to see him alive. Because again, I was on a paper route. It was someone else's route. I think it was the same person who brought me to the room, the red room that I mentioned earlier. It was that same route. And I remember that morning when I went to deliver that newspaper, seeing him sitting on the front steps of his house, just looking miserable. And I handed him the newspaper, and I said, have a good day. And less than 3 hours later, he went back in the house and put a gun to his head and died. So I don't know if that's the man who went out of his way to terrify me as a kid. The man who was Bigfoot. Or if it's a completely unrelated story. Just another story about personal misery in the Midwest. It's strange that I don't feel any effect from that zombie bite. This goes against everything I know about being bitten by a zombie. I hope it doesn't say something about me. Although I've always wondered if the undead get bit, does it have an effect? Or are ghosts immune to the bite?